Few places on this earth have watched empires rise and crumble, survived invasion after invasion, buried conquerors beneath their own culture, and still stood, not merely as a country, but as a living, breathing civilization. Most nations measure their history in centuries. China measures it in millennia. This is not just a country. This is not just a government, a flag, or a border on a map. What you're about to witness is a civilization, one of the oldest and most complex experiments in human organization ever attempted on this planet. This is the story of survival, of a people who have been conquered, humiliated, burned to the ground, and rebuilt, again and again and again, of dynasties that lasted longer than entire civilizations, of ideas so powerful that even those who tried to destroy them ended up adopting them, from the banks of the Yellow River to the towers of modern Shanghai, from the bronze weapons of ancient kings to the nuclear warheads of the 21st century. 5,000 years. In the next hour, we cover it all. This is China. Before we begin, you need to understand one idea. One central truth that runs like a golden thread through every dynasty, every war, every collapse, and every rebirth in this story. That idea is this: China does not just survive. China absorbs. Every force that tried to destroy China, nomads from the north, Mongol horsemen, European colonial powers, Japanese armies, every single one of them either failed, retreated, or was eventually swallowed by the civilization they tried to conquer. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. A deeply ingrained cultural immune system that has kept one of humanity's oldest civilizations not only alive, but dominant. Remember this theme. You will see it repeat in the Mongol era, in the Qing dynasty, in the Communist Revolution, and in the boardrooms of modern Beijing. The story changes. The lesson does not. Now, let us go back. All the way back. To the beginning. Around 4,000 years ago in the fertile valleys of the Yellow River, something remarkable began to take shape. Not a conquest, not an empire built on the backs of slaves and spears, but something rarer. An organic civilization, grown from the soil itself. The earliest Chinese settled along the river they called Huanghe, the Yellow River, drawn by its rich sediment and predictable floods. They planted millet, they built villages, they developed a writing system not borrowed from any other culture, but invented entirely on their own, one of only a handful of truly independent writing systems in all of human history. The Xi Dynasty, legendary, possibly mythological, but deeply embedded in Chinese cultural memory, is said to have been the first. Then came the Shang, with their oracle bones and bronze vessels. And then, around 1046 BCE, the Zhou, whose reign would last over 800 years, longer than the entire history of the United States. During the Zhou period, something extraordinary happened. The empire fractured into competing states, a period of almost constant war known as the Warring States period. And yet, it was precisely during this chaos that China's greatest thinkers emerged. Confucius walked these lands. So did Sun Tzu, Laozi, Mencius. The very foundations of Chinese philosophy, filial piety, the mandate of heaven, strategic thinking, the nature of the Tao, all were born in this era of conflict, origin, development, dominance, and then collapse. But collapse in China rarely means the end. It means transformation. It's the Chinese heartland. None could dominate the others for long. Alliances shifted. Cities burned. Armies of hundreds of thousands clashed on open plains. Absolute obedience to the law, and through the law, the stage was set. Two visions of China, the elegant and the iron, were on a collision course. The winner would not just conquer China, they would define it. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. He was 38 years old, and in the years that followed, he would reshape the face of the known world. He standardized Chinese writing, ensuring that people from the frozen north to the tropical south could communicate through the same characters. He standardized weights and measures. He standardized axle widths on roads, so that carts from every corner of the empire could travel the same tracks. He built a road network that rivaled Rome. He commissioned a terracotta army of over 8,000 soldiers to guard him in death. A workforce of craftsmen so vast, some historians believe, but his genius came with darkness. He burned books. He buried scholars alive. Dissent was not merely punished. It was erased. His legalist philosophy allowed no room for doubt. Why was he different? Because he was not merely a conqueror. He was a builder. He understood that conquest without governance is just organized destruction. What he created was a system, a model of centralized imperial rule that would define China for the next 2,000 years. But empires built on iron cannot survive forever. After the first emperor's death, his dynasty collapsed within 15 years. The Qin was dead. But its framework, or the idea of one unified China, governed by one emperor, under one bureaucratic system, that survived everything. The Han Dynasty rose from the ashes of the Qin. For 400 years it dominated East Asia. expanding trade routes, advancing science and medicine, and spreading Chinese culture across the continent. The Han were so successful that even today, the majority ethnic group of China calls itself the Han people. But 4 centuries of power create their own vulnerabilities. Corruption crept into the court. Warlords carved up the countryside. Famine and disease weakened a population that had once numbered in the tens of millions. By 220 CE, the Han dynasty was gone. China fractured into 3 competing kingdoms, a period so dramatic, so filled with betrayal and heroism, that it became the most celebrated saga in Chinese literary history. 3 states, 3 visions of what China could be, and none of them strong enough to hold it together for long. Centuries of disunity followed. But this was not the end. It was never the end. From the north came the nomads, wave after wave of steppe warriors. The Xiongnu, the Jianbei, the Jie, swept into northern China during the era of 16 kingdoms. They brought their own languages. This is the absorption. This is the pattern. Meanwhile, in the south, the Han Chinese who had fled before the nomadic invasions preserved the culture, the literature, the philosophy. They kept the flame alive, and they waited. The identity survived. It always survived. In 581 CE, a military commander named Yang Jian reunified China under the Sui dynasty. It was a brief dynasty, only 37 years, but transformative. He rebuilt the Grand Canal, connecting the agricultural south to the political north. He reformed the civil examination system, ensuring that government posts would go to the educated rather than the merely well-born. Then came the Tang, and with the Tang came one of the greatest golden ages in human history. Under Emperor Taizong, and then the legendary Empress Wu, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name, China became the most cosmopolitan civilization on Earth. Chang'an, the Tang capital, was the largest city in the world, home to over 1 million people and tens of thousands of foreign merchants, diplomats, monks, and artists. A new rival had emerged, the Islamic Caliphate, expanding rapidly across Central Asia. At the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, Tang forces clashed with Abbasid armies for control of the Silk Road. China lost the battle, but the trade routes remained, and with them, an exchange of ideas, technologies, and goods that would enrich both civilizations for centuries. The Tang absorbed Buddhism from India and made it Chinese. They absorbed Persian art and made it Chinese. They absorbed everything the world had to offer and gave back silk, porcelain, paper, and gunpowder. But the Tang, like all great dynasties, eventually faltered. After the Tang's collapse came the Song dynasty, and with it, an explosion of innovation. Printing with movable type, gunpowder weapons, the magnetic compass, paper money, iron production techniques that would not be surpassed in the West for centuries. All of these emerged during the Song period. Chinese identity crystallized during these centuries. The civil examination system became the primary pathway to power, creating a meritocratic bureaucracy unique in the ancient world. Confucian values were reinterpreted. Us deepened and made the bedrock of social order. Art flourished. Landscape painting reached a peak of subtlety and sophistication never equaled before or since. Poetry was considered an essential skill for any educated person. But beauty and refinement, however magnificent, cannot stop what was coming from the north. Because on the Mongolian steppe, a child had been born. A child who would grow into the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen. Genghis Khan. By the time his armies reached China, they had already destroyed the Persian Empire, shattered the Islamic Caliphate, and left tens of millions dead across Eurasia. No force in history had moved so fast, struck so hard, or devastated so thoroughly. The northern Jin dynasty fell first, its cities reduced to rubble. Then the southern Song, proud, culturally magnificent, protected by rivers and walls and some of the most advanced military technology of the age, fell city by city, province by province. The Mongol conquest of China was not merely a military campaign, it was a catastrophe on a civilizational scale. Some regions of northern China lost more than half their population to war, famine, and disease. Ancient cities that had stood for 1,000 years were leveled. Kublai Khan needed China more than China needed him. The Mongol Empire was vast, stretching from Korea to Hungary. But it could only be governed through Chinese bureaucratic systems, Chinese administrators. The Mongols, the most fearsome military force in human history, found themselves learning Chinese governance. The Yuan court in Beijing became, slowly, more Chinese than Mongolian. Chinese craftsmen made Mongol porcelain. Chinese scholars recorded Mongol history. Chinese administrators ran Mongol tax systems. The absorption had begun again, but the Chinese had not forgotten. When the Yuan dynasty finally weakened, torn apart by infighting, plague, floods, and peasant rebellions, it was a Buddhist monk turned rebel leader, Zhu Yuanzhang, who rose from the absolute bottom of society to drive the Mongols out. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang founded the Ming Dynasty, a native Chinese dynasty. The restoration was complete. The civilization had survived. Again. as it always had, as it always would. The Ming were defined by a deep suspicion of the outside world, perhaps understandable after a century of foreign rule. They rebuilt the Great Wall to its current form. They sent the legendary Admiral Zheng He on 7 massive expeditions across the Indian Ocean, voyages that reached East Africa. China turned inward, and the world moved on. They imposed their hairstyle, the queue, on Han Chinese as a symbol of submission. They maintained a separate Manchu identity at the top of society, but the Manchu also governed through the Chinese examination system. They patronized Chinese art and philosophy. They were as Confucian in their governance as any Han ruler had ever been. The Qing period saw China reach its greatest territorial extent, absorbing Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia. At its peak, the Qing Empire was the largest and most populous state on earth. But the world outside was changing in ways that China, turned inward, had not anticipated. And from across the oceans, the ships were coming. The examination system that had produced brilliant administrators for centuries had calcified into a machine for producing memorizers of ancient texts. Technological innovation, which had once made China the most advanced civilization on Earth, had stalled. Meanwhile, the population had exploded, from perhaps 150 million at the start of the Qing to over 400 million by the 1800s, and without any corresponding increase in agricultural productivity or industrial capacity. Millions lived in desperate poverty. The stage was set for crisis, and the crisis arrived from the West, carried on the hulls of British warships and in the crates of East India Company merchants. Foreign powers had arrived at China's door, and unlike every previous conqueror, these ones came not to rule from horseback, but to trade, to extract, and to humiliate. The First Opium War of 1839 to 1842 shattered the myth of Qing invincibility. British gunboats, armed with modern artillery, demolished ancient Chinese fortifications with contemptuous ease. The resulting Treaty of Nanking forced China to cede Hong Kong, open 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, and pay enormous reparations. This was not the end of the humiliation. It was only the beginning. The Second Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion, the bloodiest civil war in human history, claiming an estimated 20 to 30 million lives, the Sino-French War, the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, in which China lost to a nation it had long considered culturally inferior, the Boxer Rebellion, followed by an 8-nation military alliance that marched into Beijing and looted the imperial palace. Each treaty stripped away territory, sovereignty, and pride. Each defeat fed the next crisis. The Qing government, which had ruled for over 2.5 centuries, was collapsing in slow motion, unable to reform fast enough to resist the modern world, unable to stay still without being devoured. This period, from the Opium Wars through the fall of the Qing in 1912, is remembered in China as the century of humiliation. Not merely as history, but as a wound that, more than a century later, still shapes how China sees itself in the world. On October 10, 1911, soldiers in the city of Wuchang mutinied against the Qing government. Within weeks, province after province declared independence. On February 12, 1912, the last emperor of China, a 6-year-old boy named Puyi, abdicated. 2,000 years of imperial rule ended without a final battle with the stroke of a pen. Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, declared the Republic of China. But the Republic was born into chaos. Into this vacuum stepped 2 competing visions. The Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, led first by Sun Yat-sen and then by Chiang Kai-shek, and a small, radical new organization, founded in Shanghai in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party. For 2 decades, they fought each other, cooperated uneasily against Japanese invasion, and fought each other again. China endured. It always endured. But the cost was almost beyond measure. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Chinese Civil War resumed almost immediately. The nationalists, despite receiving massive American support, were losing the trust of the Chinese people. Exhausted by corruption, inflation, and a war that had cost tens of millions of lives, the communists, under Mao Zedong, had spent the war years building a political organization among the peasantry. They promised land reform, an end to corruption, national dignity after a century of foreign humiliation. To millions of ordinary Chinese, it was a compelling offer. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood at the gate of heavenly peace in Beijing, the same gate through which emperors had once gazed out over their subjects, and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. The nationalists retreated to the island of Taiwan, where they established a rival government that persists to this day, an unresolved wound in China's political geography. The People's Republic aligned itself with the Soviet Union, entered the Korean War against the United States, and set about the enormous task of rebuilding a country shattered by a century of war and exploitation. The task would prove far harder than anyone anticipated. Mao's great leap forward, an attempt to industrialize China overnight through sheer collective will, resulted in one of the deadliest famines in human history. The Cultural Revolution that followed unleashed a decade of ideological terror that destroyed much of the cultural heritage the communists had sworn to protect. After Mao's death in 1976, a small, practical, twice-purged veteran of the revolution named Deng Xiaoping took power. Where Mao had been ideological, Deng was pragmatic. His most famous saying, "It does not matter if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice." Deng opened China to foreign investment. He created special economic zones along the coast where capitalist market principles were allowed to operate within a communist political framework. He sent Chinese students to study at foreign universities. He lifted the price controls that had strangled agricultural productivity. 800 million people were lifted out of poverty. Cities that had been small market towns became megacities of 20 million people. China became the world's largest manufacturer, largest exporter, and eventually the world's second largest economy. In 2013, Xi Jinping assumed the leadership of the Communist Party and the presidency. Under his leadership, the centralization of political power has accelerated dramatically. The anti-corruption campaign launched in his first years removed hundreds of thousands of officials from positions of power, some guilty. They survived the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. They survived the Xiongnu and the Mongols. They survived the opium and the gunboats. They survived warlords and famines and cultural revolutions and economic catastrophes. Every time China was counted out, every time the walls came down, the emperor fell, the capital burned, the civilization absorbed the blow, regrouped, and came back. Not unchanged. Never unchanged. Every conqueror left a mark. Every catastrophe carved new channels into the Chinese character. The China of today is not the China of the Han Dynasty, and it is not the China of 1949, and it is not the China of Deng Xiaoping's reforms. It is all of those things at once, a layered, complex, sometimes contradictory civilization that carries its entire history in the way it governs, the way it trades, the way it thinks about power. We began this story with a simple idea. China does not just survive. China absorbs. In the 21st century, the question is not whether China will survive. The evidence of 5,000 years suggests that it will. The question is, what will it absorb next? What new ideas? What new technologies? What new pressures from a changing world will be folded into this ancient civilization and emerge as something new? The Yellow River still flows. The Great Wall still stands. The characters that were first scratched onto oracle bones 3,000 years ago are still written in newspapers in Shanghai and textbooks in Beijing. The story of China is not over.